We turn this week to the doctrinal and theological framework that has guided North American Mennonites in recent decades, particularly Mennonites shaped by the institutions and movements of the network currently known as Mennonite Church USA. In the 1980s, North American Mennonite academic theologians engaged in a vigorous debate about the proper focus of Mennonite theology. A primary forum for this debate was the Conrad Grebel Review, an academic journal published by Conrad Grebel College in Waterloo, Ontario. Although much of this debate was primarily of interest to scholars and teachers, it had significant implications for the Mennonite Church more broadly, insofar as it impacted the shape of the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite perspective, that the General Conference Mennonite Church and the Mennonite Church adopted in 1995, and which became the confessional ground for the formation of Mennonite Church USA. While Mennonites had been engaged with theology throughout their history, most Mennonite theology up until this point had been what we might call pastoral or practical theology, theology focused on motivating obedience to the way of Jesus Christ. In the early part of the 20th century, Mennonites got entangled in the doctrinal debates between fundamentalists and modernists, as we saw. However, not until the 1980s did Mennonites really start asking basic methodological questions about the best way to do theology, or to consider the possibility that Mennonites had theological gifts that might be of value to the broader Christian church. This new interest in theology came to supersede the historical scholarship associated with the Anabaptist vision as a focal point for Mennonite identity toward the end of the 20th century. Indeed, in North America, the interest in recovering and translating and interpreting 16th century Anabaptist sources has almost completely died out. Mennonite scholarship has shifted from history to theology quite decisively. So what were the main issues in the debate about Mennonite theology? I'll suggest at least 5, although there are certainly more than you might notice just from reading the sampling of essays in our readings for this week. First, and perhaps most basic, is the question of methodology. Should Mennonite theology be done in a different way than evangelical Protestant theology or Orthodox Christian theology? Put differently, should Mennonite theology focus its attention on Mennonite distinctives, such as peace and community, or on those convictions that we share with other Christians, such as the divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ? Second, and related to the first question, is the role of peace in Mennonite theology. Is the way of peace and enemy love a central and defining issue, or is it a peripheral and perhaps optional implication? A restriction, as it was considered in the 1921 Garden City Statement of Fundamentals. Is peace part of the gospel or a result of the gospel? Third, and also related to the first question, is the role of the traditional Christian creeds in Mennonite theology. Should Mennonites begin with an orthodox view of the Trinity, for example, even though the Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible, and even though many Anabaptists refuse to accept specific Trinitarian language found in the classic creeds because such language was not biblical? Another concern about the creeds is that they say nothing about the teachings of Jesus Christ. Fourth, Christology, that part of theology that focuses on the nature and work of Christ. This occupied center stage in these debates. Should Mennonites accept traditional accounts of atonement theology, for example, or should Mennonites reject those accounts that frame Jesus' death as a sacrifice that satisfies the wrath of an angry and righteous God? Did God will the death of Jesus, or was Jesus' death the result of human rejection of his life and work? Does Jesus' work on the cross and in his resurrection primarily change our status before God from guilty to justified? Or does it change our natures and help us live victorious and obedient Christian lives? Fifth, there is the question of how Mennonite theology related to a number of other emerging theological movements at the end of the 20th century, such as Black theology, feminist theology, and liberation theology. Some Mennonites felt that Mennonite theology shared much in common with those theologies that challenged dominant paradigms from the margins, while others worried that such cultural and political concerns detracted from a biblical focus for Mennonite theology. Arguably, these theological debates have not yet been settled and remain as a backdrop for the current struggles in Mennonite Church USA over polity and our theology of sexuality. At the same time, while Mennonites are debating these issues, there is a renewed interest beyond the boundaries of the Mennonite Church in Anabaptism and Anabaptist theology, framed mostly in terms that Bender laid out in his Anabaptist vision statement of 1943. The essay by Palmer Becker sketches out, in popular terms, the basic outlines of this neo-Anabaptist revival. Because of this interest beyond the Mennonite Church in Anabaptism, this neo-Anabaptist framework has become the primary model by which Mennonite Church USA in recent years has engaged in outreach, church planting, and missionary work, as well as in the public branding of the denomination. Not surprisingly, the Becker pamphlet was first published by the Mennonite Mission Network. This theological discussion in the Mennonite Church can be understood as an outcome of assimilation. As Mennonites find themselves looking and acting more and more like their North American neighbors, they increasingly are relying on abstract theological terms to define themselves as distinctive. If Mennonites are no longer identifiable as different because of plain dress or separated enclaves, then perhaps we can at least have a distinctive atonement theology or a communitarian understanding of the church. But these matters are no less controversial than the proper size of a woman's prayer veiling, as it turns out. I'm glad this week to also offer you a video of an interview I conducted with J. Denny Weaver 2 years ago during a visit I made to his home in Madison, Wisconsin. Denny taught theology and ethics at Bluffton for many years and is now in retirement in Madison, where he continues to write books and engage the discussion about the future of Mennonite theology. Denny has done much to shape the direction and focus of recent discussion about theology in the Mennonite Church, and is the author of one of the essays in our selection this week. I hope you enjoy the interview.